All right, so welcome. Welcome, everybody. My name is Roger Berkowitz, the founder and director of the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College. It's a pleasure to be with you today. We're here for the virtual reading group, and we are reading Hannah Arendt's, I guess in many ways, her masterwork. Certainly a book that is widely regarded as one of the most important books of the 20th century, The Origins of Totalitarianism. We discussed last week the four prefaces, the original preface, and then the three prefaces to the different volumes, on the 3 volumes: Antisemitism, Imperialism, and Totalitarianism. And today we begin reading volume 1 of this great book, written in 3 volumes. The 3 volumes, as I said, are Antisemitism, Imperialism, and Totalitarianism. And they're understanding that 3-part volume structure is important. The book is called The Origins of Totalitarianism, and yet you'd be hard-pressed to find in this book an answer to the question of what are the origins of totalitarianism. Arendt specifically says, I don't think there's an origin of it. What she says is there are multiple elements that crystallize into allowing something like totalitarianism as a new form of government to emerge in the 20th century. And what those elements are never specifically stated. There are a number of them, but 2 that clearly play a role and that encompass others within them are anti-Semitism, which we have to remember is not just anti-Semitism. It's a form of racism. And so anti-Semitism, she says on page 11, Roman numeral 11, in the prefaces, is a secular 19th century ideology. So it's not a religious idea. It's secular. And it's an ideology. It's a kind of racism, which in name, though not in argument, was unknown before the 1870s. There's been Jew hatred for a long time, but anti-Semitism is new. And so this first book of the 3-volume, this first volume of the 3 of the book, is an attempt to articulate the ways in which a particular form of racism, in this case, anti-Semitism, a particular secular ideology, in this case, anti-Semitism, came to play a role in the rise of totalitarianisms, both in Germany and also in Russia, but mostly here in Germany. She says that the book is an attempt to understand something outrageous, something which at first and even second glance appeared outrageous, namely that something as small and seemingly unimportant in the world, anti-Semitism, the Jewish problem. I mean, there's just not that many Jews in the world, right? There's very few. And something is small, and for the most part, Jews didn't, play a big role in world politics. So how did this small group of people come to play such an outsized and important role in the world, in a war, in totalitarianism, and in death factories? And that's in many ways what the book is setting out to understand, especially this first volume on anti-Semitism. It's to seek to comprehend, right? She says this book is an attempt to understand what seems outrageous. And remember the line that she repeats over and over again: understanding or comprehension means the unpremeditated, attentive facing up to and resisting of reality, whatever it may be. We're trying to understand how this happened. And to do that, to a certain extent, we need to understand that common sense doesn't help us, right? That's the title of this first chapter. anti-Semitism as an outrage to common sense. So what is common sense? She says on Roman numeral page 7, never has our future been more unpredictable, right? Never do we live in a world less predictable than we do now. And I mean, 60 years later or 70 years later, it's even more unpredictable. Never, she continues, never have we depended so much on political forces that cannot be trusted to follow the rules of common sense and self-interest. Forces that look like sheer insanity if judged by the standards of other centuries. The point she's making here is that totalitarianism is completely anti-common sense. I mean, if you're interested in living a comfortable life, if you're interested in pursuing your interests, the last thing you want to do is go to war and spend enormous amounts of money and human capital and effort simply to kill, 6 million people, a small people that doesn't matter much in the world. It doesn't seem to make any sense. It doesn't seem to follow normal, sane rules. It looks like insanity. And she says the forces of insanity that oppose common sense can be summed up in the two ideas of scientific hope in human omnipotence versus despair at powerlessness. She says that scientific hope and despair at powerlessness are two sides of the same coin, progress and doom, science and determinism. Science tells us we can move into the future and create some sort of utopia. Doom or determinism tells us that we can't change anything. And so these two forces sort of go back and forth, and yet we hope to, and we believe in these ideologies that somehow will save us from doom and determinism and allow us to create a common world, a better world. And so this is the source of the discrepancy, she says, between the unimportance of the Jewish question and the fact that it set the whole infernal machine in motion. And this is what she calls an outrage to our common sense. And so she begins this chapter by asking a simple question, which is to say that, is anti-Semitism important, right? It shouldn't be. It should be this little itty bitty thing. And yet, is it important? And she says, most people have said it's not important. It's important to the Jews, but, they just can't believe that anti-Semitism would actually be important to the rise of Nazism. And she says that most people see it either as an accident, right? It's just an accident that anti-Semitism was chosen by the Nazis as an ideology, or they say that it was simple propaganda used to sway the masses, but it wasn't central to Nazi ideology and to the Nazi worldview. She says that our outrage at what happened and our belief that it's just not commonsensical for anti-Semitism to be so important leads us to minimize it. But she says we need to take it seriously. She says we need to understand that anti-Semitism was actually the driving force in many ways of Nazi ideology. And so the next 100 pages of this book are an attempt to take anti-Semitism seriously and understand it. Okay, how do you do that? Well, the first step is to understand what anti-Semitism is not. And she says, we've been harmed in our attempts to understand anti-Semitism and its importance because we have 4, what she calls hasty explanations of anti-Semitism. In a sense, 4 mistakes. And these 4 mistakes, she says, are what most people believe was the source of Nazi anti-Semitism. In some believe 1, some believe 2, some believe 3, some believe 4, but these are the 4 that most people accept. And she thinks they're all wrong. And so the first chapter is simply clearing the ground of what she considers the wrong explanations. And I'll tell you, most of us are going to be upset that she says some of these things are wrong, because she's going to challenge some of our common sense. So what are the 4 wrong explanations? The first one says that anti-Semitism is related to nationalism. In essence, whether in Germany or in the United States or France, wherever there's anti-Semitism, it's because of a rising nationalism that sees Jews as foreigners and a threat to the nation. And she says this is simply wrong, historically wrong, factually wrong. She says on page 3, the fact is that modern anti-Semitism grew in proportion as traditional nationalism declined. If you look at this period of history, it's a period of imperialism, and thus not nationalism. It's a period of internationalism. Both Nazi socialism and Bolshevik socialism were internationalist movements that had a very weak connection to either German nationalism or Russian nationalism. In fact, they were internationalist movements. And so to the extent they did use nationalist rhetoric, and they did, they used it not as a motivating force of their ideology, but simply on not convinced members of the populace or on fellow travelers, but not for the Nazis or the Bolsheviks themselves. And so she says it's just simply factually wrong to think of anti-Semitism as a product of nationalism. And we'll talk a lot more about that in the chapters, both in chapter 2, but also later in the book, in the chapters on imperialism. The second mistaken explanation of anti-Semitism is that anti-Semitism emerged because Jews had power and people were jealous of that power. She says common sense teaches that anti-Semitism is a reaction to the Jews' great wealth and power. And again, she says this is simply factually wrong. She says the Jews, to the extent, I mean, most Jews were poor and powerless. There were some Jews in the 17th and 18th and early 19th centuries that did become wealthy. But in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when anti-Semitic parties emerged throughout Europe, was precisely at the time when these wealthy Jews were losing their power. And they were losing it for very particular historical reasons, which again, we'll go into in chapter 2, especially next week. So she says, well, okay, that seems strange. Why is it that anti-Semitism emerges not when Jews are powerful, but when they're losing their power? And she here turns to the great French social thinker Alexis de Tocqueville, and she quotes him at length on page 4. And she says that according to Tocqueville, the French people had hated the aristocrats in France about to lose their power more than it had ever hated them before. So as long as the aristocrats held power, their wealth and their privilege weren't really hated, but they were respected. It was only once they began to lose their power that their wealth came to be seen as without visible function. And that's much more intolerable because nobody can understand why it should be tolerated. The basic insight that Tocqueville has here is one that he repeats in his more famous book, at least here in the United States, Democracy in America, on pages 17 to 18, or at least in the introduction, in my edition, 1718, but in the introduction, where he says, quote, "It is not the use of power or the habit of obedience that depraves men, but the use of power that they consider illegitimate, and obedience to a power they regard as usurped and oppressive." It's a very deep insight of Tocqueville that Arendt here elevates. We don't hate power. We hate unjust power. And as long as the aristocracy had power that people understood and were within their understanding of why the aristocracy was noble and had power, they accepted it. And the same, she says, for the Jews. we didn't hate the Jews when they actually had power. We came to hate the Jews when they were losing their power. And so, these raises really interesting questions for today. Why is there a rising anti-Americanism? People say, oh, because of American power. I think it's much more interesting. It's because we're at a time when America is losing its power. Why is there a rise in anti-intellectualism or anti-expert sentiment? Oh, because the experts and intellectuals have power. No, it's because we're living in a time in which the experts and the intellectuals are losing power. And so this is an important part of all of Arendt's work. For those of you who study Arendt, power for Arendt is not something to be run away from. Power is valuable. There's a rational instinct that power has a certain function and is of importance, she says. It's only when power is being lost that suddenly power seems unjustified. The third, those first two explanations and why they're wrong are largely factual, and I don't think they're super controversial. The next two, however, are controversial, and they are going to cause some discomfort. So the third reason, she says, the wrong reason that anti-Semitism, the wrong explanation for the rise of anti-Semitism as an important part of the rise of totalitarianism, is that anti-Semitism emerged because Jews were seen as scapegoats. So a scapegoat is a very simple idea, namely that there was no reason the Jews were chosen. They were simply chosen because the Nazis needed somebody. And the idea behind this, she says, is best expressed in a joke that circulated amongst the Jews in Germany at the time. And that was actually made into a play in a concentration camp at the time. And it sort of became famous for that. But the joke goes very simply. An anti-Semite goes, the Jews are responsible for all the problems in the world. We must kill the Jews. And someone answers him, no, not the Jews. It was the bicyclists. And the anti-Semite goes, why the bicyclists? And the other guy goes, why the Jews? The force of the joke is quite simple. Why the Jews? It's arbitrary. It implies that anyone might have been the scapegoat. The bicyclists, the Jews, the people who wear hats, the people who, are right-handed. It could be anyone. The victim is purely innocent and arbitrary. Now, she says this is simply wrong. There has to be a reason that the Jews were picked, and the reason there has to be a reason is because before the anti-Semites take power, they actually have to persuade the people that they're right. They have to make arguments. The arguments don't have to be true, but they have to be persuasive in some way. And so there must be some non-arbitrary reason that the anti-Semitic parties could say the Jews were the cause of all world problems and not just the bicyclists. And so part of the effort of her book is going to be to try and understand that reason. Now, she says that this refutation of the scapegoat theory is universal. Anytime anyone uses scapegoat theory, you should be suspicious of it. She says, in the particular case of the Nazis, there was, however, a reason to actually think maybe the scapegoat theory in this particular instance was true. And she calls this the totalitarian exception, namely that because in totalitarian states, like in Nazi Germany, any Jew, simply because they were a Jew, could be arrested, put in a concentration camp, and killed. There is a certain kind of arbitrariness to this terror. Whether you're a Jew who works for the Zionists or you're a Jew who fought in World War I for the Germans and sees themselves as a German nationalist, you can still be terrorized and killed. And this arbitrariness suggests that the Jews were purely innocent and that they were being killed simply because they were scapegoated in an arbitrary way. But Arendt again says, even here, there must be some basic reality to the scapegoat's guilt, so that at the beginning, before the terror emerged, you could convince the people that it was necessary to institute the terror in order to carry out a specific political ideology. And so she says, once again, you have to ask yourself, why the Jews? It can't just be arbitrary. Now, I just want to be very clear. There are people who say Arendt is simply what we call today blaming the victim, right? Well, to say that there was a reason the Jews were chosen means that the Jews themselves were at fault. And she is specifically not doing that, but you can understand why some people might say she is. What she's saying is, look, it's not the Jews' fault. It's not that they did things wrong. It's not like we should blame them. No, the people who to blame are the Nazis. But that doesn't mean that there weren't things the Jews did that upset other people and that could be used by the Nazis. And if we want to understand anti-Semitism, we have to ask the hard questions. Why the Jews? By the same token, today, if you want to understand anything, homophobia, transphobia, racism, you can't just say it's arbitrary. You have to understand, you have to try and ask the hard question. The last false or wrong reason that she offers is what she calls the fallacy of eternal anti-Semitism. The fallacy, eternal anti-Semitism is simply the idea that people have always hated the Jews and they've always persecuted the Jews. And so this is simply nothing new. She says it was obvious why the Nazis were attracted to the thesis of eternal anti-Semitism, because it took away their responsibility. If people throughout history have hated the Jews, no problem for us to hate the Jews. So we're not responsible. We're no different than good Christians and, good Turks and good people in the Austro-Hungarian Empire and good, people in the Arabian countries. So she says the Nazis had every incentive to embrace the idea of eternal anti-Semitism. But she says what was fascinating was how the Jews embraced the thesis of eternal anti-Semitism. She says on page 7 as a desperate misconception. The Jews understood that if they believed in the theory of eternal anti-Semitism, that became what she says, quote, on page 7, an excellent means for keeping the people together, so that the assumption of eternal anti-Semitism would even imply an eternal guarantee of Jewish existence. You have to see what she's trying to say here. There's a Zionist desire for eternal anti-Semitism because it proves the need for Jewishness and thus for Zionism. Again, I understand the provocative nature of her argument, but we have to take it seriously. For the same reason, in a world of assimilating Jewry in the late 19th and early 20th century, if you wanted to protect Jews from assimilating and preserve Judaism, one good technique would be to say, you're assimilating to an anti-Semitic culture, and therefore you should stay Jewish. Similarly, around questions of race or homophobia or whatever today, if you want to preserve your culture, you want to assume that racism of any type is universal and eternal and can't be changed. And there are many people making that argument today. And Arendt is saying that the danger of the eternal anti-Semitism thesis is first that it absolves the Nazis and others of responsibility. And second, against what the Jews thought or hoped, it doesn't preserve Judaism. It threatens it with genocide because it allows for the justification of anti-Semitism as simply normal. It normalizes it. Both, therefore, these last two explanations, which she says are wrong, the scapegoat theory and eternal anti-Semitism, she says on page 8, deny specific Jewish responsibility and refuse to discuss matters in specific historical terms. Now, again, I understand this is a controversial argument she's making, and I'm looking forward to talking about it with you, but I just want us to understand it. The last page or so of the chapter is a looking forward to much later in the book, to the sections on totalitarianism. But what she says is that you have to understand that Plato and the Sophists got into an argument. Now, the Sophists were, sophomore, wise fools, but the Sophists were the lawyers. And they were the ones who made arguments in the Greek assembly for particular ideas. And they were good at turning facts around like lawyers are, using facts and changing the story and manipulating facts to tell a story. And what she says is that Plato sought to oppose the Sophists and argue against the Sophists because the Sophists denied truth and elevated opinion. And Plato wanted to create a society based on truth. But the Sophists understood that everything in politics is about opinion. Arendt is actually closer to the Sophists here than to Plato. She thinks there is no truth in politics, that all politics is about opinion. But what she says is, with the modern Sophists, the anti-Semites, their aim is not to attack truth, but to attack reality. They destroy facts and reality. And in doing so, comprehensibility. They attack the dignity of human being, which is to comprehend. And so if we accept these false explanations for anti-Semitism because they make us feel better, because they don't make us ask the hard question about Jewish responsibility, she says, we fail to comprehend anti-Semitism and we fail in our humanity. We fail to be human. And she thinks the only way to resist the evils of anti-Semitism is to comprehend it. Remember, comprehension is the unpremeditated facing up to and resisting of reality, whatever it may be. And resisting of reality requires comprehending it even when it's outrageous and even when it's uncomfortable. So what is the source of anti-Semitism? If these are the four wrong arguments, well, that's what the next 3 chapters of the book on anti-Semitism are going to be about. And she says that chapter 2 is going to be about the nation state and certain equivocations around Jewishness in the falling apart of the nation state in the late 19th century. The biggest one, just so you can think about what you're going to read for chapter 2 for next week, is this idea that on the one hand, the nation state wanted to make everyone equal and thus make Jews equal. On the other hand, they needed the Jews to be different. And they needed thus to give the Jews privileges to not be equal. And the Jews embraced that equivocal status because they wanted some equality, but also some inequality, because they wanted to resist assimilation and they wanted to be different. And that this equivocation, she says, leads to incredible dangers for Jews. And the Jews got benefits from it, but also great danger came from it. And then in chapter 3, where she talks about Jews in society, she's going to talk again about how there came to be this idea of the Jew, which again was greatly dangerous, but also had certain advantages, and thus Jews embraced it for particular reasons. And then the 4th chapter, the last chapter, is an account of the Dreyfus affair in France, which is, in her mind, a dress rehearsal for the entirety of the Holocaust. And so that's how this first book on anti-Semitism is going to look. But today is simply mostly the negative part, how we free ourselves from these misconceptions and learn to ask the hard questions to comprehend and thus resist reality, whatever it must be, in this case, anti-Semitism. All right. I look forward to the discussion. Recall there's two ways to engage the discussion. One is through the chat, which I see is open and already active. Please do be respectful of others, which means you can disagree with them, of course, but disagree with their ideas. Don't attack them as a person. It's very important. Look, we're talking about very complicated issues here. Anti-Semitism, racism, transism, all these things can come up. Please be respectful of all of us and all of your fellow participants. You can also go down to the reactions button, click on raise your hand, and engage in the discussion in that way. I'm going to make an effort to call on people in ways that bring in many different voices. So I'll go in order to the extent I can, but I encourage people to participate in the public discussion. I know it can be uncomfortable. I know it's scary, especially around complicated issues, but we'll treat everyone with respect, and I encourage you to participate. Okay, James, you're up first.
The structure of something has more to do with what it is than what it says it is. For a people or an identity to gain momentum and identity in space, they need to see themselves in opposition to same. I loved your summation, Roger. Everything was hunky-dory, anti-common sense, totalitarianism. The one thing, in conjunction with the reading on this, I'm reading about the Third World War, in the war that doesn't say its name. I'm reading about the history of Libya, Iran, and Iraq for the last 30 or 40 years, and what's been happening in Afghanistan. You're encouraging us to not think that there are totalitarian structures in play there. The one thing that my experts tell me, expert being the guy who does the measurements for my doors and windows from Pella Windows, who's from Ukraine. I said, what do I need to know about the Ukraine war? He said, simple, it's money. The war has to go on so people can make a lot of money. For the staking of the boundary of my property, I meet a Russian who's been here for 30 years. I hate Putin, but I love Russia. He says, I said, what do I need to know, Vladimir? He said, American, cheap chicken shit. Both of these gentlemen are saying the war could be over in 10 minutes if people weren't trying to make money over it. This whole Strawman drawing that we're looking at in this book seems to invite pondering how much money is being made. That's the only thing that makes sense about totalitarianism in creating this anti-Semite promulgation against the people to create this tension to make money. Blow some holes in me, please.
Thanks, James. Arendt will talk a lot about money in the second volume of the book on imperialism, where money is going to play a big role. And imperialism is going to play a role as the precursor in many ways to totalitarianism. But the main reason for imperialism as a precursor to totalitarianism is less money itself and more the infinite growth of internationalism and the busting of boundaries and borders, which allows movements to aim at total world control rather than just local world control. You say your workmen around your house say it's all about money, and I think that's a common sense view. Arendt's view about totalitarianism is it's specifically not about money, right? There was no money to be made in creating dozens of death camps that cost millions of dollars and took away thousands of soldiers who could be fighting the war in order to simply exterminate a people. From her point of view, and she's not alone, I mean, almost every economist who's looked at this agrees, the death camps were completely outside of any military or economic interest. So why do them? She thinks that there has to be other reasons.
You don't think the Nazis had such a weak sense of identity that they needed to present apart from themselves an identity that they could destroy and thereby activate and create their own identity?
Well, I think that's probably part of it, but that's not a monetary idea.
No, it isn't.
And so you have to, I mean, so yes, I mean, this book is going to look at non-monetary ideas because she thinks money cannot explain totalitarianism and the Holocaust. She's not going to ignore money, right? Money is going to play a role, and you're going to read a lot about money. You're going to read about gold. You're going to, but in general, she doesn't think. I mean, what shocked Arendt, and especially shocked her husband Heinrich Blücher, who was a Spartacist and thus quasi-socialist, was the way in which the war was fought outside of traditional military questions of military interest. The way in which it was fought on ideology and ideological grounds, racist grounds. And that's what she's here looking into in volume 1 on anti-Semitism. All we're doing in this particular chapter is trying to clear the ground of what she considers to be mistakes that prevent us from the difficult effort of comprehension. So let's focus on that right now and try and understand why these 4 typical understandings of totalitarianism, right? Nationalism, anti-power, scapegoating, and eternal antisemitism are so powerful.
Thank you. The hole is blown. I'm ready to go through it.
Okay. I just want to point out that I'm looking at who's got their hands up, and they're all men right now. I'm not against that. I just want to encourage people who might otherwise want to participate to participate as well. Peter, you're next.
Thanks. I'm also a bicyclist, by the way. We have many identities, right?
Yes, we all do.
It's a tough chapter. You're doing a great defense. I mean, part of me wants to beg the question also, why do we have to take Arendt seriously? All you simply said is we must. I don't expect that to be otherwise from the Arendt Center, but I don't get it. They blame, and I'm not blaming the victim, but they're responsible. I think that's a tough circle to square. I think if you say a woman is responsible for being raped, I don't know how that's not blaming her in some way. Are Black people responsible for being lynched, or 100,000 other ways in which folks of color have been demeaned in the not eternal history of this country, but a heck of a long history of racism in this country? And I think similarly, it's not a dart that was thrown that picked the Jews rather than the bicyclists. The joke is actually to say, yeah, if one was serious about this, they both would be seemingly a dart throw. I don't think it's a proof of anything. I think if anything, it's a proof of the absurdity. But the absurdity isn't absurd because of a eternal, and it's not eternal, of course, it's an incredibly long narrative, a narrative that isn't just a narrative told by some poet in some far corner of the universe. It's a narrative taught by the central premise of European society, which is Christianity. So I don't get the surprise. I don't get what she's trying to uncover and trying to figure out how the Nazis, and how could they have picked this group of people? And again, some of these compromises about the death camps certainly weren't quote unquote non-profit, but they weren't lacking in profit. They made money at many of the camps. They didn't make enough money to justify them. But it was a compromise of a whole bunch of things. You had ideologues, you had business interests, you had true politicians, you had people who wanted homes that they didn't have. There were 100 ways in which the Nazis use, again, the Nazis. Who are the Nazis? That's a simplification. The ideologues employ the various ways in which people are motivated to help along with their ideological desire to fight two wars, a war against on the ground in military fashion, and a war against the Jews, who they had in an ideological way a belief were the true sunnum malum, the thing of all things that's causing evil in the world. And most evil of all was the idea that all people are equal. Again, this is this theory of one historian I heard at Yad Vashem, who says that's the horror that the Jews were posing. The Nazis had a totally different theory, and their theory was order and disorder. And disorder was being done by those who were trying to claim that the lesser people should be equal, when the Nazis knew only the Superman, the Aryan race, should be those on top. And so they truly were evil, if you believe that ideology. They were upsetting the order of the universe by letting lesser people have an equal access to power, to wealth, and to property, and all sorts of other things, when that was antithetical to the Nazi ideology based on this theory. So there are lots of reasons that pre-existed. Yeah. And I think it's really hard to buy that this isn't a blaming of the victim. Most of the things you could claim the Jews were doing that might anger Aryans, anger Germans, anger white people, anger Europeans, were, as they are in this country, projections of the oppressor upon the victim. They were put into positions that basically the oppressor had created to personify the very thing that they were hating the Jew for. Certainly one of the greatest examples of this is creating non-human beings out of Jews, and therefore proving that they're non-human beings, as though that's the status they were in before the Nazis put them through concentration camps. And it's the same as, imagine saying a person of color is uppity when they're actually being, asking for some respect. This is a projection of the white oppressor. This is, I'm not getting this particular piece here. I'm interested in what's to come in the next chapters, but I don't think this is a head scratcher. And I'm not sure why I have to take it seriously in this chapter then.
So first of all, I want to thank you for, asking the question. It's a good question. And I think a lot of people would shy away from it, because it's the RN Center, and I appreciate that you didn't. And so thank you. First of all, so I'm going to, a couple things, because I think it is a good question. I'm going to take it seriously. I hope I didn't say, and if I did, I take it back, that anyone must take RN seriously. I think that if we want to understand her argument, we need to take her seriously. That's I hope clear. And secondly, her argument is that if we actually want to understand what happened, we have to risk seeing beyond common sense and risk uncomfortable inquiries and uncomfortable decisions. But you can certainly disagree with Hannah Arendt, and I'm not here to tell you you can't. So there's no must take her seriously. I think Hannah Arendt is worth taking seriously in order to provoke us, in order to make us think, in order to make us question our unthought prejudices and our unthought opinions, because she does that quite powerfully. After which you can either hold on to your former opinions, you can amend them in some way, or you can say, you know what, I've been convinced by Arendt, but and a whole lot of things in between. So there's no must, and I'm not trying to offer a defense of Arendt. I'm trying to help those of us on the call to understand her, which I think is a valuable exercise, because I think she's a thoughtful and brilliant and non-traditional thinker who makes us think beyond our own preconceptions. That's the first. The second is you made a quick comment about how some of the death camps were profitable. There are different kind of camps. There's concentration camps, there's work camps, and there's death camps. work camps, one can at least make the argument that maybe they have some value. But death camps, it's hard to make that argument. And I don't know any economist, and certainly she didn't. She cites a number when she talks about it, that would make that argument. And that's all I was speaking to. But let me come to the key, part of your question, which I think is the important part, and which I spend a lot of time talking about with my students when I do teach this text, which is that blaming the victim, that seeking to understand Jewish responsibility is no different than blaming the victim. Arendt was attacked for this again 13 years later after her book Eichmann in Jerusalem, right? Where in one part of the book, she talks about the way in which certain Jewish leaders, both in the Judenräte and in Jewish communities and in the camps and themselves, the capo, bear some responsibility in the whole thing. She makes it clear again that she's not blaming them for it, but she says they bear some responsibility. And in that instance, she was widely criticized for blaming the victims. Less so in this book. Why is it not blaming the victims? I mean, could it be? Maybe. But I think that the reason I think it's not is that she doesn't think that the Jews should be held responsible for the Holocaust. She doesn't think that that the Jews are to blame for discrimination against Jews. She doesn't think that the Jews are to blame for the murder and the raping of Jews. And she thinks that would be absurd. And she says it. So what does she think? What does it mean to say that they are in some ways responsible? And is responsible a meaningful term in this sense? Well, what she means is that a couple things. One, that the Jews gained something from taking on some of these positions that were also embraced by anti-Semites, right? If an anti-Semite says the Jews are different, the Jews at times said, you're right, we are different. Why? Because that was how they could justify living separately and preserving Jewish culture in an age of assimilation and equality. Now, that's not something that they should be blamed for, right? She doesn't put any moral blame on them. But she says their willingness to, in a sense, embrace a kind of Jewish separateness is one of the reasons they could be attacked by those who are blameworthy. It's not just random, right? A group of people who don't want to be seen as separate and get certain privileges where they can, not follow the laws against working on Saturdays or Sundays or eating different foods or things like that. She says, look, these were reasons. Now, doesn't mean they're good reasons. Certainly doesn't mean they're blameworthy. Arendt is not a fan of assimilation. She thinks there's good reasons to not assimilate. But she thinks that if we're going to understand what happened, we have to understand the ways that there became incentives for Jews to embrace precisely the kinds of desires for separateness, difference, uniqueness, even blood difference, which we'll read about in chapter 3, that the Nazis used. And again, not in a way that the Jews are blamed for what happened, but maybe she says we need to rethink what it means to be Jewish today. And that's going to require us understanding the hazards of simply embracing privilege and difference and separation in an age of equality. And so part of it is simply we have to understand it in order to be able to resist it. But also simply as that's what it means to be human, is to try and actually understand what happened, not simply give ourselves illusions that make us feel better, because that won't in any way allow us to prevent it from happening again in the future. So that's my attempt to answer your question, Peter. And it's a good question, because my guess is that the vast majority of us agree with you.
I don't want to challenge you on the other points about the camps. I never said they were profit making. I just said there was profit to be made in instances, although net was not profit. But I think the issue of here claiming, and I know there's so many hands up, so I'm going to try to be as brief as I can, but it's tough because it's highly complex, is that in effect it says Jews are responsible insofar as, one, they were separate. They weren't separate, they were separated. They were often kept in, I mean, the word ghetto began with Jews in Italy. Jews were kept out of societies. They were kicked out of England in the 1200s, kicked out. I mean, this is absurd. This is saying you're separate. No, we were separated. I happen to be Jewish. I happen to be child of survivors. My parents were not in camps, so I'm not feeling sensitive on that. But I do think there's an insensitivity by Hannah Arendt to make this claim. And she is not, provocative isn't good enough as an excuse for this claim. It's highly injurious. Because one, I'm not looking to be separate, and I'm also not looking to assimilate and deny who I am just to please the majority. That's not to say these behaviors might not set off a response by a majority or a power group, but that's a different thing from a behavior and a responsibility. Responsibility suggests the person themselves is doing this and therefore deserves some blame. I don't know how you can disassociate or disconnect blame from responsibility. And well, I won't respond no matter what you say. I'm sorry. I know there's too many people waiting.
One is moral and one is not. She's not saying, I'm sorry, I got lost in a sec. But first of all, she makes a distinction between Jew hatred and anti-Semitism, right? Yes, there's been Jew hatred way, way back, but it didn't lead to totalitarianism, right? And what she's talking about here is a particular kind of ideology that leads to totalitarianism. And that, she thinks, is new and is different. So, the idea that it goes all the way back, she thinks that can have rhetorical value for the Nazis and for other things. But I think, but if we want to understand what's happening, that's not going to help us very much. Again, all I can say is I hear your point. As we read chapters 2, 3, and 4, and then even 5 and 6 in the next section on imperialism, where she talks about racism and is going to make similar comments about racism. What I'll say is she's attempting to understand what's going on, and she thinks that it's simply we're evading reality to take these explanations on. I'm sure it will come up again, so I'm going to stop there and let some other people ask questions as well. I'm going to just bring in some other voices as well and keep going back and forth. But Hannah, you want to go next?
Sure. I am just wondering, in terms of thinking about totalitarianism, whether we should be thinking more broadly. And I'm thinking about Arnold J. Toynbee in an essay called The Destruction of Poland. He discusses Germany's attempt to exterminate the Poles before the First World War through starvation and other means, and also Timothy Snyder's Bloodlands, discussing this region, Poland, Belarus, Lithuania, Ukraine, and how both Hitler's Germany and Stalin's Russia were acting against independent states in this corridor. And if you think about it in terms of a through line with the current war in Ukraine, it seems to be part of a much broader picture. And I was just wondering if you could comment on that.
No, it's a great question. I don't know the Toynbee book. I haven't read it. I've heard of it. The Snyder book, Bloodlands, I do know well, and it's a great book. And by the way, he largely reads a lot of what's going on in the Ukraine through Hannah Arendt in Bloodlands. You're right. It wasn't. There were other groups and other groups that were that were targeted by the Nazis. Poles, Roma, homosexuals, sick people, mental sick, physically handicapped, or other, camp, and many others. It's not unimportant, and I think any meaningful account of the Holocaust has to consider those. Her account is based, though, on what the Nazis said and wrote. And if you read what the Nazis said and wrote, the centerpiece of their ideology was against the Jews. It wasn't against the Poles, right? They didn't like the Poles, and they saw the Poles also as inhuman in some way. But the centerpiece was against the Jews, and that has to be taken seriously. By the way, if you look at what's it called? Neo-Nazi websites and neo-Nazi groups in the United States today, and you go to their public websites and you read also what they write in private to their followers. I'm talking about anti-Black racist groups in the United States, and anti-trans groups, and anti-homosexual groups, and anti-immigrant groups. They almost all begin with anti-Semitism. It was the Jews are at the root of it. There seems to be some deep need for the Jews to be at the source of almost all wildly, rabidly racist groups. Now, one answer to that is Peter's, right? It's eternal anti-Semitism. There's no explanation for it except that. Arendt is telling you, or asking you, to at least hold out to think about the fact that there is a reason for it. Not that the Jews are bad, but you have to understand why the Jews are in a position in society that they're the ones being targeted, and they're the ones providing the justification even for targeting these other groups. And that's what she's trying to figure out in these books, in these chapters. So you're right, there are these other groups that are killed and attacked, and yet the argument she's making, and I think she's right, but again, we can talk about it, is that the foundation for it is an ideological anti-Semitism. John.
Roger, this is sort of I'm hoping this is a guide that I've got it correctly. As you explained in your summary, what you're asking us to do, or suggesting, is that Hannah Arendt has laid out a brief or a case and stating these are not the reasons that anti-Semitism existed. And I'm prepared to buy that exploration. She certainly doesn't. I'm not going to argue whether she's right about the 4 items that you suggested. It's certainly not at this point in time. But my guide is going to be, or as I understand your direction, she's casting aside these eternal reasons that anti-Semitism or hatred was we need to put it aside and let us examine other causes and think about other causes. And so I'm prepared to do that. Can I expect that as we go forward in this in this book and in her thesis, that she's going to lead us to where she stands? She hasn't proven, certainly in the first few pages, her case, as in my mind, that we should put aside these reasons for anti-Semitism. I just want to add this. So I'm using this as a guide. I'm using your comments that I should look for explanations, and I have to dig deep, that she is going to lay out her case as we go forward, why these don't exist. I'm prepared to do that. The one I would like,
John, absolutely. There's no, I mean, if you were to take her, just from chapter, this is by the way, this is a 5-page chapter. If someone expects in 5 pages for her to give the entire, account of why anti-Semitism matters, it would be a bit much, right? She simply started.
I appreciate that. I'm taking that as, I'm just using that as a guideline. I just want to add this as one point. I've been throughout my life. I'm of the generation that was immediately after the Second World War. I've experienced total in this country. I've lived my entire life here. Many rounds, many experiences in growing up and through my professional career of anti-Semitism. I've often wondered why it exists and what are the reasons for it, and try to depersonalize it. When I look around and I come to the, when I've seen hatred that has been experienced in parts of Africa that had nothing to do with anti-Semitism, but the violence and the hatred is equally as venomous. And there were Holocausts that had nothing to do with the Jews, but existed in other parts of the world. And so I've been fascinated. And one of the things that seems to, that I've sort of centered some sort of thinking on, is that it's almost endemic to our species. And I start from the point that we come from a group, we're Homo sapiens. They came over the top of the world 100,000 years ago, I think the dates are right, and wiped out the Neanderthals. Why? And so is it endemic or central to our makeup as Homo sapiens to carry this type of hatred for the other? I'll leave it there. Roger, I can't hear you.
There you go. Sorry about that. It's a great question, John. Thank you. The idea that it is endemic to hate, is a big question. And my colleague Ken Stern here, who runs the Hate Studies Initiative at Bard, and I have had many, interesting conversations about this. Hate is a human emotion. You probably couldn't have love without hate. But this goes back also to Peter's question. Arendt doesn't think that anti-Semitism is about hate. Jew hatred is about hate. She thinks anti-Semitism is a political ideology, and that they're both bad, by the way, but one is much worse than the other. And so from her point of view, that's an important distinction. And we'll again, and just to go to your other question, yes, we are going to talk a lot about her understandings of where the ideology of anti-Semitism comes from. That doesn't mean she's going to give you like the one answer that's going to solve your question, right? But I think she's going to show you, or I hope she's going to at least show you that there are other reasons for why anti-Semitism has become such a powerful political idea in modern life, right? Jew hatred is still there, and it may be go all the way back to the Christians, and there are people who still hate Jews as Jews, but that's not what she thinks was going on in Nazi Germany amongst the Nazis. And you know, she's going to cite a lot of Nazis. And people say, oh, well, why would you cite Nazis? She's like, because if you actually want to understand what caused the Nazis to do what they did, you got to read the Nazis. You got to listen to them. And some people don't like that. But she believes you have to. I just put in the chat a link to a speech given at Bard by Eric Ward about 5-6 years ago at our conference on anti-racism. And Eric Ward is one of the leading scholars and activists against hate groups in the United States, neo-Nazi hate groups, and racist groups. And he makes this case not from an Arendtian point, but simply as an empirical person who studies hate groups in the United States, that the overriding ideology of them is anti-Semitism, and that's the foundation of even modern racism here in the United States. So I put the link to the talk he gave at Bard 4 or 5 years ago in the chat, and I encourage you, if you're interested, to take a look at it. Sandra Moore, you're up next. Sandra, are you there?
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. I just wanted to say a couple of things in terms of the ideas that are in the first chapter and also being discussed. You were talking about doom and determinism. I think determinism is a very heavy and important word for us to be looking at. I grew up in a Presbyterian culture, a Calvinist culture, where God knew everything, including where every atom was in the universe. And therefore, there's really nothing that existed that wasn't known, you know, by some super force. And I think that we're living at a time where both artificial intelligence and the tank-like movement of certain elements of the Republicans are being dealt with in a deterministic way. Like, Trump can't possibly win, but people are saying he could win, he will win, and they're talking about things as if he has already won in many sources on the news and on the web. And so I think that all of us have this feeling that things may be determined for us rather than something we can step into. I would be very curious how people would think that Arendt, if she were alive now, would see not so much Trumpism as Steve Bannonism, like the actual theory behind Trump's way of amplifying people's hatred and amplifying people's anger, and maybe their stupidity too. Okay, those are my comments.
Thank you, Sandra. So, I mean, thanks for picking up on the hope and doom and progress and doom and determinism angle. Arendt repeats these lines almost verbatim in a number of her later essays. So in The Human Condition, she talks about doom and determination, hope and doom being two sides of the same coin. I think also in Conquest of Space, she uses the same language. These are this idea is obviously one that meant something to her, and it's here expressed on page 7 and 8, Roman numeral 7 and 8 in the preface to the first edition, where she says this book has been written against a background of both reckless optimism and reckless despair. And I think, what is reckless despair? It's what you just said. Well, Trump's going to win. We can't do anything about it. Or AI is going to take over the world and we're all going to be killed and we can't do anything about it. You know, there's also reckless optimism. AI is going to take over the world and it's going to perfect the world, and we should, you know, embrace it. Both the sort of scientific optimism and the despair that we have no power are two things Arendt finds deeply dangerous. And she saw in the rise of totalitarianism both reckless optimism and reckless despair. And in many ways, her book is, as you say, a call to somehow resist both and try and actually embrace our freedom to act in some way. So yeah, I appreciate the point you made. I think it's a good one. George.
A couple of brief specific questions, Roger. This has to do about the blaming the victim situation, which I think is central to my confusion about Arendt using her social political divide in various contexts. I'm speaking here about, you mentioned the Dreyfus affair, and that made me think of Lazar and Arendt and the whole concept of conscious versus unconscious pariah, which is the conscious pariah is the German Jew and the unconscious pariah is the East European Jew, and that carries over to Little Rock too as well. So probably we can discuss it again. But I think this is a central to at least my confusion with Arendt's thinking.
So I don't know what made you think that a conscious pariah is a German Jew and an unconscious pariah is an East European Jew. I've never heard that before. Certainly not something Arendt would say.
That was something that I've been thinking for a long, long time about, and found some literature that specifically notes Arendt that particular. This has to do, for instance, with her criticism from Jews about the Eichmann trial and all that, and blaming again the ghetto people. Think there's a German East European Jew split here that I think she carries on to social political splits in other things. But you know, this may not.
George, look, she does at times characterize shtetl Jews or East, what some people would call East European Jews, and she certainly sees herself as a Yekka, and so there is some element of that. But I would just say, to caution, people say all sorts of the damnedest things about Hannah Arendt. I was sent an article yesterday by one of our members saying that Hannah Arendt is the intellectual prophet of Bitcoin, which just blew me away. So I mean, people say all sorts of things. A conscious pariah is someone who is an intellectual and stands apart from the world in order to understand it. A pariah is someone who simply is oppressed in the world and is forced to stand out in the world, not because they choose to, but because they have no other choice. Certainly not all German Jews are conscious pariahs, and certainly not all European Jews are pariahs. So I think that's just a tendentious characterization is all I could say about that.
Yeah, all I was meant here is that this has to do with something that she's pushing in a different way, is for a victim to have agency. And whereas the conscious pariah is in one aspect of being able to having agency, the unconscious is another. She says this about Rosa Luxemburg. I don't want to go into that whole thing, but
no, conscious pariahs have agency. She's acting here as a I mean, to the extent you think she's becoming a pariah because of what she says about Jewish responsibility, she's willing to risk that in order to be human in her mind, which is to think and try and understand. That's her effort. So that's fine, and we'll kind of come back to it. But Jerry, I know you've been waiting patiently, and I always hate to make Jerry wait too long. So Jerry, let's hear.
Thank you, Roger. I was struck by the comments today very, very strongly that how different this book is read today than it was when it came out. People were reading this book in taxi cabs when it appeared over 70 years ago. They were intrigued by what Arendt was going to do in this book. Now I find that is not at all, from the comments, not at all the case. And I wonder why that is. Is it just that we are so much farther removed from the experience of World War II, from the experience of totalitarianism? Because the point of this is that Arendt, in this book, has done something, whether one agrees with it or not, that question is different. She has disrupted the whole history of political thought because she has found a new form of government. That is her proposal. That is what she proposes, a new form of government. It's not tyranny. It's not aristocracy. It's not autocracy. It's not monarchy. And it's not democracy. It's something absolutely new. And when people read this book, when it came out, they were intrigued from the beginning how this, she doesn't say this really till the end of the book, how they were led from their own experience of fighting totalitarianism or having been subjected to it in some cases and survived.
Yeah.
To me, that is absolutely striking today in this conversation. And I really wonder what there is behind it. What the message that Arendt clearly makes for the future readers of her book, which is completely ignored, is that we're not in totalitarianism now. That, as she puts it in her own words, in this book, where she doesn't talk about pariahs at all, for example, in this book, she says, we only after totalitarianism, only after it's become a thing of the past, will we realize the problems of our own time. It seems to me that here today, that has been turned upside down and shaken like a rotten milkshake. Sorry, that's it.
Thank you, Jerry. I appreciate it. When Arendt published this book in 1950, it was the first book she published, right? I mean, let's be, she had written the Von Hagen book, but it had not been published. I guess she had published the Augustine.
Here it was, the first book, Roger, yes.
Yeah. And, so she's being read as, first of all, a survivor. She was in a camp in Gurs. She's being read as a major Jewish intellectual. And she's being read because, as Jerry said, people were sort of desperate to figure out why this happened. and I think, today, and by the way, this book was widely read and is considered one of the great books, but it was criticized, but it wasn't criticized for this. It was criticized, a lot for being, for its bringing Russia and Germany together. For the communists, the American socialists were very upset about that. And there were other parts, but it wasn't really criticized for this. Part of, I think, what happens is it's that people are reading, we read this book now, after having had the discussion for 50 years of Eichmann in Jerusalem and the question of whether Arendt blamed the Jews there, and B, with this modern politics of don't blame the victim, and an incredible and, right, I think, Peter, I agree with, right sensitivity to blaming the victim. And I think that one of the things that's happened is it's made it harder to take Arendt seriously at what she's trying to do in this project of understanding, because there are things we're not supposed to say or not supposed to do. And we, we do have to figure out how to navigate that. And I think, Jerry, you're right. It's harder. We're reading her in a different way now than we read her 70 years ago. And that's part of the challenge. Gilbert.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much. So mine is not a question, but is a comment. Then please, I would like to share with you how I faced anti-Semitism on behalf of a friend of mine who is a Jew. So during this year, I was given 2 times a gift from my friend who is a Jew. Then the first time I went to receive that gift through a bank. While being in the bank, I found there a banker. That banker, while I think he knew, while seeing the name of the one who gave me that gift, he started telling me how bad the Jewish people are, and so on and so forth. Finally, the second gift that I was given, I went there to the same place. Then while being there at that same place, they completely refused. They completely refused that I can receive the gift from the bank, while telling me that I need to tell them who is that person, what a kind of activity that person is doing. For me, I was really, really shocked by seeing that. In short, that is my witness. As a final thought, I realized that anti-Semitism is still existing in silence in this world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gilbert, and I appreciate your witness. And without a doubt, you're right. And that's why reading this book is so important. So glad we're all doing it. I thank you for it. Talita, is it Talita?
Oh, yeah,
right?
Talia.
Talia.
Yes. Can you hear me?
I can.
Yeah. I thought I was not. I thought there wasn't enough time for me. I would like to bring an Israeli researcher. This is what I'm going to rely on. His name is Youre Separate. What he says in the first place is that his criticism is that of Hannah Arendt is that she refuses to bring up or to involve psychology or psychoanalysis like Freud or Jung. And so he does, and he evokes psychoanalysis analogy for anti-Semitism. What he says in very short sentence is he compares Nazism and totalitarianism and the totalitarianism of the Nazi with extending Nazism to the extent of what he calls collective megalomania. The thing about Nazism from the point of psychology, the other person, and in this case a group, becomes a subject-object or an object-subject. It means that the anti-Semitism of the Nazis or the Nazi regime in psychological terms is the subject-objects that defines them. You see, the Nazis, that's clear, I suppose. I don't have to go.
Yeah. Let me. We're at time closely. Let me just respond briefly and say that if you read, when we read chapter 3, Talia, right, on the Jews and society, you'll see that there's a lot of what we might call psychological thinking, and analysis going on. Arendt is not certainly never going to say we should never consider psychology. She thinks psychology is quite important. I would say there's two responses to that. One is she doesn't think psychology is the only thing that's important, right? And so chapter 2 is going to offer a political as opposed to a psychological attempt to understand totalitarianism and anti-Semitism. And also she worries about certain psychoanalytical theories that are become, as someone else was saying before, determinist, and seek to think that this is the way the mind works and this is the way it works, and therefore we have no other options. So she resists that aspect of psychology as a science, which is why she's often said, and rightly said, to be suspicious of psychoanalytic theory. But she's quite psychological in her analysis of social anti-Semitism in chapter 3, which we'll get to in 2 weeks. We are out of time, and I know there's still some people, Zara and Rachel, but hopefully you guys can bring your questions back up in the next few sessions, and I'll try and make sure to get to you. Thank you guys all so much.
Roger, sorry, just 1 second. I promised Susan that we were announcing her dialogue groups. If we could do that before we say goodbye. Okay. Susan, do you want to say something real quick, just when you meet and what do you do on Mondays? Unmute yourself, say hello. Susan, are you still here?
I'll do it for her.
Great, thanks, Roger.
Susan Oberman is one of our members, but has very generously and with great hard work been helping to organize these dialogue groups that go along with the virtual reading group that allow you to talk with small groups of people from the reading group to go further into the texts. The people who've engaged in these have really loved them. They've become quite popular, and we're forming new dialogue groups all the time. So if you'd like to, please send an email. It's on our website. If you go to the website and go to the virtual reading group page on our website, you can find the email to write to Susan in order to ask to join one of these dialogue groups. Is that enough? Is that good, Yana, or should I say more?
That's great. Thank you, Roger. And I just put the link in the chat in case you're interested.
And the link is in the chat. Thank you all very much. Look, these are complicated issues. I really appreciate the pushback. I like that. Let's keep it going. And let's enjoy reading and find value in reading Hannah Arendt. And we'll see you next week reading chapter 2. Thanks very much.
Thank you too.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Gracias.
guys.
Ciao.
Professor Roger.
Ciao, ciao. It's good to see you guys.
Lo mismo, the same.
No. Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom. Shana Tova.